Thank you, Professor Syed for Alatas. You can, it would be great if you can join us here for the Q&A session. Yes, it's happening now. I think that was an interesting exposition on what is progressive Islam, and I think it provides a good conclusion by basically tying it up together with how the civil Islam discussion was yesterday, and in trying to what I captured was that progressive Islam is more of orientation for self and how to see things, whereas civil Islam should be how a discourse should be conducted within the society. I think that those are my thoughts for now. I would like to open the floor for questions. Try to keep the questions short. So we'll have a first round of questions. I'll take only 3 questions. Try to keep it short and sweet so that we'll have more rounds of questioning. And please introduce yourself. Thank you. Please advance to the mic and fire away the question.
Thank you, moderator. Prof. Alatas, I want you to explore more about what is the difference between progressive Islam, transformative Islam, and Wasatiyah movement and Islam Hadar itself. And Islam itself, because we know that Islam itself is inherently already progressive, already liberating, and already transformative. Secondly,
can you introduce yourself?
My name is Muhammad Sultani. I came from Indonesia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Secondly, how about your idea, your opinion about the opportunities and challenge facing progressive Islam in Malaysia, when we know that political authority here is so powerful? How about how to implement in this idea in the grassroots? And third, I think the last, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, okay. Moderator. I'm Muhammad Abdul Aziz from UIA, still student. What I'm going to ask is, today and yesterday we have no civil Islam, and today progressive Islam. As the first question introduced, that there are so many terms in Islam: liberal Islam versus moderate Islam, progressive Islam, conservative Islam, civil Islam, even uncivil Islam maybe. So what I'm going to ask, I want to draw the conclusion of your conclusion that Maqasid plays a very significant role. To my best knowledge is Maqasid is the contested idea. So both progressive and conservative Islam, they look for the ideal Maqasid. So I'm going to ask, which Maqasid should we agree with? I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Ihsan from IRF. Very interesting talk indeed. In a nutshell, I think what I got, or something like a conclusion of the talk, when it comes to defining progressive Islam, one of the most important part is the approach towards modernity and also tradition. There's some critical element towards modernity and tradition, while at the same time taking the best out of the two. And you also mentioned about, and when we understand progressive Islam, and how does it relate to a bigger scale of the Islamic reform project over the past maybe 1 or 2 centuries. You mentioned about the important elements of revising the methods of understanding religion. Part of it is Maqasid Sharia, as mentioned by the previous person who gave the question, and also what is being introduced by Ibn Khaldun itself, a more socio-historical element. Could there be other approaches which we have learned, mainly from the European or Western approach of knowledge, which other aspect which could also be introduced to the method that we learn about Islam, and what could be this method which could actually come up with to be something like a support more on the progressive Islam discourse?
Okay, so the first question on what's the difference between Wasatiyah and progressive Islam, or between progressive Islam and Islam Hadari. Wasatiyah, you know, as it has been used, is an empty slogan. It is used by people that I would consider as moderate, but it's also used by people I would consider as extremists. So it's practically useless. I don't mean the Quranic term, but I mean the way it has been used in, you know, by different Islamic movements. Everybody talks about Wasatiyah. Our government talks about it. Yusuf Qaradawi talks about it. Many people talk about it, but they exist across a spectrum of orientation. So, but when you get down to how they actually define things, what they actually say on certain issues, and if they are governments, what they actually do to people, then you can see it is not Wasatiyah. So we are not, you know, here to, our purpose here is not to engage in some, you know, very abstract discussion and talking about generalities, right? We're talking more specifically about what we mean or what we envisage by, you know, a better or progressive society. And I try to do that by defining progressive Islam in terms of moderation, but I'm not using moderation or wasatiyah in a polemical or you know, empty sense. I've defined it in terms of 10 continua, right? And then you also said Islam itself is already progressive. Well, yeah, of course we know that. I did say that at the beginning, but look what the Muslims are saying. Look what they are doing. Look at certain, you know, approaches, certain schools of thought. They are very problematic. So you might say Islam is progressive, but a lot of Muslims don't seem to know that and are not behaving that way. So that's why we are emphasizing the progressive, the progressiveness of Islam when we say progressive Islam. But let's go beyond the term. Let's go beyond the rhetoric. We are talking in a substantive manner about what we mean by progressive Islam. You see, I didn't have a chance to discuss it, but it's in my paper. When you say Islam is progressive, what do we mean by that? Islam as a revelation, the deen, the revelation, yes, it's progressive. But when that deen is interpreted and practiced by people, you get a different kind of Islam, right? You get, for example, okay, the deen of Islam is what? It is, the Quran says it is sirat, right? Sirat al-mustaqim, it's a straight way. And there's only one sirat in the Quran. The word sirat does not appear in the plural, right? Now, there are different ways you can be on that. You know, sirat is like a path, right? A way. There are different ways you can travel on that path. You can take bus, you can take taxi, you can take Grab, you can take beca, you can take Delman, if anyone knows what Delman is. Horse-driven carriage. And all of those ways are right. All of those ways are right. So they are all, in other words, correct or legitimate from Islamic point of view. But there are also ways of practicing Islam, what you might call tariqah, some of which are on the sirat, some are outside of the sirat. You understand? So when we talk about Islam at that level, at the level of tariqah, at the level of sabil, you know, sabil, when you say fi sabilillah, in the way of God, when you talk about Islam not as a deen, not as the correct sirat, but rather as interpretations and practices that may be outside of the sirat, then we're talking about a practice and understanding of Islam that is not progressive, that is not moderate. So when we don't use the term Islam in such a broad, abstract manner, be more specific by what you mean. You know, are you talking about the revelation? Yeah, that's progressive and that's perfect, we say. But the minute human beings interpret and practice and concretize it, that's where you get progressive interpretations of Islam and practices and non-progressive interpretations and practices of Islam. So that's what we mean. So don't, you know, quickly jump at us and say, oh, you are saying Islam is not progressive. As if Islam is not progressive when you say progressive Islam. Okay, the next question was something about authorities. What can we do to instill this? I mean, this question is always asked. We can only do what we are doing, which is, you know, talking about it, trying to conscientize people about the problem. But let me say this, and this is what I usually say to, especially to the young people. When I was your age, there was not such a vibrant, youthful civil society, critical about the situation. In Malaysia, you did not have so many young people like yourselves that did not buy into the government discourse, they did not buy into the state discourse, or did not buy into the opposition discourse. Muslims today in Malaysia, and it's also the case in Singapore, are far more critical of the situation and are far more autonomous in their thinking. So this is a very good development compared to when I was a youth. So you may be inclined to think, no use talking, whatever you say, you know, the government is too powerful, the forces are too strong, nothing will change. But things have already changed compared to my time when I was your age. And we hope they will change for the better in the future with the generation of your children. But it can only change for the better if you are active now and you don't give up and you don't become, dejected, or you don't lose hope. But you need to be more active in certain things. And I gave the example of Christian bashing, right? To increase, to have more voice, to be more vocal. Imagine if Muslim groups come to the front, come up, and defend the rights of Christians, or criticize those Muslims who engage in Hindu bashing, or they do all kinds of, they throw cow head into the temple and this and that. Muslims come out and say, we don't accept this. This is not part of our tradition. And then we quote Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, the 11th century Muslim scholar, who respected Hinduism, right? And in a chapter in his book, Kitab Mal al-Hind, the chapter on the Hindu belief in God, in Arabic, he says, "Ittaqaduhum billah subhanahu wa ta'ala." He's saying that the Hindus believe in Allah. We are saying here the Christians cannot use the word Allah. But Al-Biruni is saying the Hindu believe in Allah. That's our tradition. We need to know our tradition and be more vocal about it. Because when Muslims in this country are more vocal, then the politicians change their tune. They sing a different song. That's the only way. I also want to say that I wish more of our rulers would be like the Sultan of Johor. I mean, regardless of what his intentions are, overall, right? I mean, but on this laundromat issue, this laundry thing in Muar, he did the right thing. More of the rulers should come out and put the religious authorities in check and make sure you have good type of muftis in office, so that you have nice fatwas, good fatwas, progressive fatwas, right? And real scholarship among the muftis. So these are the things we know what should be done. We know what should be done, but we can only urge and push for these changes. Okay, the last question about the maqasid. Somebody asked about which maqasid. Okay, see, maqasid, these two ideas, maqasid sharia and asbab al-nuzul, these are classical ideas. But my point is that we can benefit from modern social sciences which talk about ideology. Ideology refers to ideas that reflect the interests of particular individuals and groups. They could be class interests, they could be gender interests, they could be ethnic interests, and other kinds of material interests. How ideas, how these interests condition the emergence of ideas. That is a very important part of the context of revelation. For example, by using this method, we can understand something about the emergence of Islam. Right? See, when Islam emerged, when Islam was revealed in Makkah, you have class dynamics going on. The ulama don't talk about it because they don't have this way of thinking, but it's a reality. The trade of Makkah, when Islam was revealed to the Bani Hashim, the Prophet was from Bani Hashim, when Islam was revealed to the Bani Hashim, the fear among the Bani Umayyah and the other clans was that the control of the trade of Makkah, if Islam became a dominant religion and a prestigious religion, the other clans, Bani Umayyah and other clans, were afraid that they would lose control over Makkah as a trading center, as a vibrant commercial center. It would fall into the hands of the Bani Hashim. And from there started the long-standing conflict. It explains the problems with the Khalifa Yazid and the other Bani Umayyah. Islamic scholarship, historical scholarship, shows that the Bani Umayyah were among the worst of Muslim leaders, most of them, with one or two exceptions, the Khalifa Omar ibn Abdul Aziz being one of them, right? But you know, many of them were at best they were womanizers. Yeah, but at worst, you know, they persecuted people, they murdered people, and this conflict starts from the time of the Prophet. It has a lot to do. It's not simply that they rejected Islam, they don't like Islam. It's not simply that. It also has to do with the class background, with material interests. So the sociological approach or the socio-historical approach helps us to better understand many things in Islamic history. It also helps us to understand Islamic law, Islamic rules and regulations. I can't go on, you know, speaking too much, but you see, you know this, what is it called? This rule about diya. What is it called in English? You know, when when somebody commits murder, he can be forgiven. Blood money can be forgiven by paying a certain amount, right? This is part of Islamic law. It's a law that cannot be used today in our society. How do we explain that? You can only explain it through the socio-historical method, that it made sense in the time of the Prophet and in certain types of societies. Because if somebody, because you're talking about tribal society, somebody from tribe A kills somebody from tribe B, all right? Now, according to our rules, the person from tribe A should be executed, okay? But in Islamic law, if the family of tribe A pays compensation to the family of tribe B, then the fellow can may get off with a lighter punishment, or maybe not, you know, not a death penalty. All right? Now, that made sense during that period. Why? Because if the fellow from tribe A, the murderer, were to be executed, then tribe A goes to war with tribe B, and there's a tribal feud for generations. So the blood money helps to solve the problem. We cannot do that today. First of all, if you execute somebody for murder, it's not going to cause a family feud today. So we don't have the same context. We're not a tribal society. Secondly, we're living in a different kind of society. A murderer from a rich family can get off because he can pay the money. There can be bribery, there can be corruption. So it's a completely different circumstance. So that's why we need this socio-historical approach. In this sense, we are talking about maqasid sharia. We're talking about asbab and nuzul in a sense, right? Or the asbab of certain rules and regulations. But we are applying a socio-historical method that we learn from modern social science to strengthen this, this method of maqasid sharia or asbab and nuzul.
Assalamualaikum, Ni Abdul Razak. Prof, you mentioned one thing about the features of progressive Islam, and one of the things that you say that is missing in the notion of Western concept of progressive is moderation, striking the balance between two extremes. And you did mention one point that is very interesting to me. how do you balance in celebrating diversity between not being too excessively inclusive, that you include everyone, and not being too excessively inclusive, that you exclude everyone but yourself? The question is, how do you define, do you concretely define being moderately inclusive? If you ask Jakim, they will exclude everyone but themselves. Not only liberals, but also Shia. But to some large group of self-claim moderate Muslim, it is hard for them to include Ahmadis in Islam. So how do you define that, and how do we go about doing that? Thank you.
Good morning, Doctor. I'm Oziro from IRF. Okay, you said that progressive Muslim is who can balance with tradition and modernity. But how come if someone said that we need no tradition to counter with modernity, because we today live in a modern world that have many changes in terms of value and system, whereas tradition is about the value and culture of the past. Even sometimes the tradition is crucial to understand some things, but the dynamic of the world make many things in tradition have been assimilated and lost its tradition identity and come to be a modern identity. So tradition is the past and let it be the past. How is your opinion about this?
Okay, thank you. Let me just quickly deal with the last question first. Well, I guess some people take that position. Among them would be Salafis. It's like the modernist Salafis, I think, you know, the so-called, like we refer to them in this part of the world as kaum muda, right? Some of them would take a more critical approach towards tradition. They would be critical of Sufism, for example. They're not like, you know, the variety of Salafis who declare Sufism to be haram and Sufis to be out of the fold of Islam. But some of the modernist Salafis did take a critical view towards Sufism and other traditions, regarding them as irrational and not conducive to modernization and so on. So they have that view. But I think, you know, when we, again, you know, the social sciences are very important, anthropology, sociology, that study the role of tradition in society, that study the, you know, the function of tradition, regardless of the truth of, the truth claims of traditional ideas. But there are important functions of tradition, and the fact that many traditions survive and have been able to be integrated into modern life is testimony to that. And it is also a fact that you cannot destroy tradition. Tradition is there to stay. What we need to do is, as I said earlier, to distinguish between those aspects of tradition that are in line with Islam, with Islamic spirit, that are in line with our, you know, humanistic values, that are egalitarian, that don't privilege one group over another, and so on and so forth. And this we can do. They are not done not because we don't understand our tradition and we don't understand Islam. It's because of the forces against us. Everybody knows that Islamic tradition, however you define it, is against corruption, is against abuse of power. Everybody knows that. But why aren't we able to make any inroads there? It's not because we don't understand Islam or we don't understand our tradition. The first question about, what was the first? Oh yeah, how do we? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So in other words, you talk in the abstract, we should strike a balance between exclusivism and exclusivism. Inclusivism and exclusivism. We should strike a balance. That's in the abstract level. Now, how do you actually practice that, right? What do we actually do? Now, I would say there are two guiding factors. One guiding factor is tradition. When we go back to tradition, you mentioned, you know, Shiism, for example. Now, in Sunni tradition, we do not adopt the approach against Shiism that is adopted now in Malaysia officially. That is not to say that Sunni scholars have never had a problem with Shiism. They have lots of problems with Shiism, theologically, with aspects of the Aqidah. Not so much with the fiqh part, but more with the Aqidah. There are. but not to the extent where they say they are out of the fold of Islam. It is against Sunni tradition to do what we are doing to Shiites in Malaysia today, persecuting them and declaring them as deviant and out of the fold of Islam. That is clear. And that brings me to our next point. Consensus. The consensus of the Sunni ulama generally has been that. There is a range of views about to what extent certain things in Shiism are acceptable to Sunnis. For example, some Sunnis will say, taqiyya, the doctrine of dissimulation of taqiyya. This is a Shiite, very fundamental aspect of Shiism, and some Sunnis say this is wrong. Right? But there are many Sunni scholars, traditional classicals of the classical period, who say taqiyya is allowed in Sunni tradition. What is the name? Fakhruddin al-Razi, for example, one of the early scholars, took that view. And many of the Shafi'is and the Hanafis said this, that taqiyya is acceptable practice. So you have these kinds of discussions, disagreement or agreement with the Shiites, but not that they are out of the fold of Islam. And they have always been allowed to attend Hajj from the very beginning. So it's ridiculous to engage in this, to doubt whether they are Muslims. So if tradition is something safe to hold on to. The tradition, but then you can say, well, the tradition could be wrong. But then you have the consensus of the ulama among the Sunnis for generations, for centuries. So the third factor is power. If you have power and influence, then you can get the right view across. If you don't have power and influence, no matter how strong the tradition is, the wrong views will be put across. So we know what our tradition is, but we find in Malaysia that wrong views are being put across because of the people in power. And then the final point about the Ahmadis, right? Okay, now that is a problem, right? How do you strike the balance? If any particular group says that the Prophet Muhammad is not the last prophet, honestly, we cannot say they are Muslims. We are not obliged to be totally inclusive. If a Christian comes to it and says, I believe in the Prophet Jesus, I believe in Jesus, but as Son of God, but I believe in him. I want to be, so I submit to the will of God, so I want to be called a Muslim. We can't. And similarly, we do not deny the right of any other religion to establish their boundaries. Isn't it? It's only fair. We can't go to the Christian and say, we want the right to worship in your church because we are Christians, we follow Christ. Well, we follow Christ. So you must accept us. We have to respect their boundaries and they respect our boundaries. It should be like that with the Ahmadis. But if I were to say that an Ahmadi who does not accept the Prophet Muhammad as the last prophet, if I were to say that the Ahmadi is not a Muslim, I in no way have any hatred or animosity towards him and do not agree with the persecution of Ahmadis. There is moderation there. And in this society, in this country, and I think in the case also in Indonesia, there is not that moderate approach. Not only are they not regarded as Muslims, but they are persecuted, there's loss of property, and I don't know whether even life, loss of life. But we need to make that distinction between accepting and respecting boundaries and the integrity of a particular group, which is not the same thing as then persecuting or engaging in hate speech against the group that we do not consider as part of us.